There's a universal desire that exists, and that is simply this: to have meaningful relationships. Not one of us in this room lives under a rock. Each of us desires to have a friendship, to connect, to interrelate. It's how we're wired. It's how God made us. And the question is, how do we engage that? Because really, when you get down to it, we live in a terribly lonely world. In fact, we live in such a lonely world, despite the fact that we have all sorts of wonderful methods of communication, more so now than perhaps at any other time in human history, but yet we still struggle with loneliness. And there's a hurdle that gets in the way, and that hurdle we're going to look at as we explore, as one commentator said, a classic of friendship. Paul illustrates for us in this portion of Thessalonians what a meaningful relationship looks like. And he gives us actually 5 different levels, or 5 points, if you would, very short. I'm going to not spend a ton of time on each one this morning, but there's these 5 steps that exist in 1 Thessalonians that outlines for us. It's not an exhaustive outline, but it's an outline nonetheless of how we can cultivate deep, meaningful relationships. So let's take a look here at 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, picking up in verse 17, and we're going to read on to chapter 3, verse 10. But we, brethren, having been taken away from you for a short while in person, not in spirit, were all the more eager with great desire to see your face. For we wanted to come to you, I, Paul, more than once, and yet Satan hindered us. For who is our hope, or joy, or crown of exaltation? Is it not even you, in the presence of our Lord Jesus at his coming? For you are our glory and joy. Therefore, when we could endure it no longer, we thought it best to be left behind at Athens alone. And we sent Timothy, our brother and God's fellow worker in the gospel of Christ, to strengthen and encourage you as to your faith, so that no one would be disturbed by these afflictions. For you yourselves know that we have been destined for this. For indeed, when we were with you, we kept telling you in advance that we were going to suffer affliction, so it came to pass as you know. For this reason, when I could endure it no longer, I also sent to find out about your faith, for fear that the tempter might have tempted you and our labor would be in vain. But now that Timothy has come to us from you and has brought us good news of your faith and love, and that you always think kindly of us, longing to see us just as we also long to see you. For this reason, brethren, in all of our distress and affliction, we were comforted about through your faith, for now we really live if you stand firm in the Lord. For what thanks can we render to God for you in return for all the joy which we rejoice before our God on your account, as we night and day keep praying most earnestly that we may see your face and may complete what is lacking in your faith. With that said, we're going to look at 5 elements of a healthy relationship as outlined here by Paul. We have a foundation, we have opposition, we have a derivation, we have communication, and finally we have the elation. We open here as Paul explains that he desired to be with the Thessalonians. He had been kept from them, and the idea here, which is being conveyed, that Paul was speaking almost as if he was an orphan, a bereft child, someone who had lost a parent and was pining and longing and almost grieving to be in their presence. And his attitude is reflected in what we see in Philippians. His attitude reflected that of what Jesus shows for us. Philippians 2 explains to us, do not merely look at your own personal interests, but also look for the interest of others. Have this attitude in yourself, which was also in Christ Jesus. And what we find here is that Paul had a level of love for this church which was really unparalleled, especially in that day and age among people who were very self-centered and selfish. And what we find here is that Paul's driving factor here, what's fueling the fire, the gas in his engine, if you would, is a sense of agape love. He cares for the Thessalonians. He wants what's best for these people. His love is not driven by emotionalism. His love is not driven by any sort of selfish ambition. His love is not driven for the fact that he's just tolerating things. But what he desires is for them to grow closer to God. What he desires is to see them through the eyes of Christ, through the foundation of the cross. And he has this commitment to them. And when we get down to it, the notion of agape love in Greek, the idea here is not one of just camaraderie and having a lot of things in common with somebody. It's not a mutually beneficial relationship whereby, well, you do this for me and I'll do this for you, a tit-for-tat type of a thing. Instead, what he is speaking of here is unconditional love. There's no strings attached. There's no desire for reciprocation, although he wants to see them grow. He is not out for any sort of personal interest whatsoever in the course of what's taking place here. And this is what we see, not just in his attitude, but his actions. Everything about Paul is not just going to be wishful thinking, but it's going to manifest itself in how he behaves, how he engages, how he interfaces, how he speaks. And we find that in 1 John chapter 3, the reflection of where Paul is coming from when he has this attitude manifesting in action. It tells us here, we know love by this, and this is a beautiful way of defining that he, a reference to Jesus, laid down his life for ours, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoever has the world's goods and sees his brother in need and chooses and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? Little children, let us not love with word or with tongue, but in deed and in truth. The last day before I departed from a job working at an insurance company, we were ready to leave for Texas to go into seminary. I walked into the office, and I had been a supervisor. I had a handful of people in a unit that was, I was in charge of. And I walked into the office, and sitting on my desk was a package. And I opened up this package. It was from everyone in the unit that I was working with. And in there was a briefcase. It was a leather briefcase that must have cost an enormous amount of money because they scratched out the price tag, but it was absolutely gorgeous. And they gave this gift to me. There was no hinges to this thing. There was no, well, okay, what kind of review are you going to write for us? Or, how are you going to help us along in our work? It was my final, there's nothing I could do in response except accept this beautiful gift. And it was a great illustration of what agape love looks like. It is a desire to see something good in another person's life with no sense of strings being attached. That brings us really to the first point that we see in the passage, and that is this. Meaningful relationships are hinged upon love unconditional. We are called to love unconditionally. And this is what Paul illustrates as he opens this particular pericope in Thessalonians. He's not looking for anything other than to give himself over to them. That's the foundation. Number two, we find here there's this opposition. He mentions in the passage that the enemy had stopped them. Now, we don't know what that looked like. Could it have been a legal issue where a governor had put together a decree and outlined Paul as being an outlaw? It could have been an illness. It could have been some other form of opposition, civil unrest. We don't know. But what we do know is that we live in a world where there's almost like these two giant magnets pulling us in polar opposite directions. We have God and we have Satan. And the two are drawing and trying to woo others. People in the middle, you and me, in these two different diametrically opposed places. Ephesians makes it clear what this looks like. The Apostle Paul says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the forces of this darkness, against spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places." Jesus said it clearly, if you're not with me, you're against me. And he puts this picture out as to what humanity is going to look like in the middle of this giant cosmic battle between good and evil. And we're sandwiched there. And as we grow closer to God, as we seek Him, as we pursue Him, as we develop and cultivate a relationship with Him, we're going to run into opposition. And that opposition is not just going to exist between us and God, it's going to exist between every relationship that exists. Our failures, old wounds, insecurities, money, fidelity, you name it. There's going to be a whole host of things thrown at us to keep us from growing closer in every relationship that exists. So what we find here in Thessalonians is really our second point, and that is obstacles abound. In this world, in this life, every relationship you enter into, there will be obstacles. It's just the reality of the world in which we live, because of the fact that we have these two forces of good and evil at war with one another, and we're stuck in the middle. It's sad, but you see people going through life thinking to themselves, we're going to have this carefree, laissez-faire, easy path to take when it comes to relationships, and it's just the opposite. In fact, I believe God allows for obstacles and hurdles and problems to occur to enable us to grow stronger, to grow closer to Him and to one another. But this is just a simple reality in life. We are going to face a host of obstacles. Number two. The third is what I call a derivation. Paul expressed toward the Thessalonians a sense of true altruism. Altruism, by pure definition, is to have the interests of others ahead of your own. And what he explains here is that what is his hope and what is his joy in this relationship, but it's them. It's watching them. It's seeing them. It's revolving around them. Philippians explains it this way. Philippians 2:3. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. The early church displayed this tremendously. When somebody was struggling financially, they came to their side. They bought the food. They bought the shelter. They provided with clothes. There were people who were conscripted to salt mines to die there during certain eras of church history. Other believers voluntarily went into those mines to die with them so that they wouldn't be alone. There were times when people lost their jobs and fellow believers rallied around them to help them through those difficult moments. There were times where they would line folk up. This was not uncommon in some of the cities during the ancient times, where they would line people up and just ridicule you, and you'd have to stand there and people would walk by and insult you and in a public forum. And fellow believers, when they saw another brother or sister who was being ridiculed in a public setting, would go and stand just next to them and allow those same insults to fall on them just the same. Perhaps one of the best ways I could illustrate altruism for you is this. It's using my umbrella. I want you to imagine it's raining here on the stage. All right? And here I am with my umbrella on the stage. And it's raining down. And now all of a sudden somebody comes to my side. Altruism does this. That's really what it is. I'll take the hit so you could be okay. That's what altruism does. And that's what Paul, in love, is displaying toward the Thessalonians. Point number 3 is really quite simple. Agape love creates altruism, a sacrificial mentality that is reflected in action. We find the fourth point coming up is communication. Paul cannot be with the Thessalonians. He can't interact with them personally. He doesn't have a cell phone. He can't Facebook them. He can't do any sort of a video chat. So what is his alternative? He sends Timothy, because he realizes that communication serves as a foundational piece to a meaningful relationship. It requires agape. It's going to run into obstacles. There's going to be a sense of altruism, but communication remains tantamount in order for that relationship to grow and flourish. You can't be silent. You need to speak and you need to listen. It is part of the process. And sadly, what happens today is that people may have sentiments toward one another. They may have a desire to display agape love. They may want to be in relationships. But if you don't listen, if you don't communicate, if you don't speak, if you don't disclose and bare your soul to someone out there, everything breaks down. And what we find here with Paul is that he dispatches Timothy to learn about the Thessalonians, to encourage them, to bolster their faith, to renew their hope, to stir their hearts and to convey his sentiments through Timothy, who is able to reach them and communicate with them. And this is what happens here, because Paul is concerned about their well-being. He doesn't want them to be shaken by the absence of him or the absence of the communication. How many times, and people use this as a weapon, it's part of passive-aggressive behavior, we play the silent treatment. And that's how we get back at people. We leave them guessing. We put them in the dark. And Paul wants to dispel any thought of such treatment. In fact, he is so concerned that his silence may impact them. He uses a very strange term here to describe being disturbed. He doesn't want them to be disturbed. The King James says he doesn't want them to be shaken. The New International, the NIV says unsettled. The word is very unusual. It's only found once in the New Testament. It's literally a dog wagging its tail. And you've seen, you ever see a dog, they get super excited, and their tails are like rattlesnakes. They're going like crazy. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You walk into the house and your dog is like jumping all over you, and you see that wagging here. That's the picture that Paul is painting of their faith. And he doesn't want their faith to be somewhat disturbed, unsettled, and shaken, that he wants them to be solid in their relationship with God and in their relationship with himself. And therefore, he's going to communicate. He's going to listen and learn. And this is what we find here. James says it quite well. James 1:19, when he says this. This you know, my beloved brethren, but everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And what we have here is really the picture of what communication involves. Listening and learning. And both are critical. Listening sometimes more so than speaking. I came across a great interview just this past week. Some of you are football fans and you're looking forward to seeing the Chiefs play against the 49ers next Sunday. And they were talking to Andy Reid, the head coach of the Kansas City Chiefs. And Reid's a unique guy. And he's very open to learning and growing, and has some very solid relationships, and uses that as a foundation for his leadership style. And they asked him once, where do you get your plays? Because they have some unique plays that they run on the Chiefs team. And he says, well, I get them from all over the place. He said, I actually got a play from a janitor. And he's like, you got to be kidding me. And he's like, no, I listen to people. They're important. He says, we were working, and there's a guy, he was a custodian at the stadium. And he was watching the Chiefs play and running their things, and he went up to Reid one day. He says, I got a play for you. I think you're going to like it. And it wasn't a good time, so Reid said, just hang on to that, buddy. We'll talk again. And a few days later, this janitor comes up to Andy Reid and said, I got this really good play. I think you're going to like it. Again, the timing was off, and he kind of sloughed him off a little bit. Finally, the third time, the janitor goes up to Reid. He says, I got this play. And Reid looks at him and says, look, I'm really busy. Put it on a card. Just on an index card, draw it out for me, give me the steps, and just give it to me, and I'll take a look. Well, the guy, the following day, finds Andy Reid, and he has the play all sketched out on this index card, and he gives it to him. Reid takes it home. He looks at this thing. He said, this is a good play. I don't think anybody's pulled this off ever before. So he has the guys practicing this particular play. They go over it, several times. They get comfortable with it. They're in the middle of a game. They're making their way down the field. And he says, we're going to call that janitor's play. He sends it in. No one had ever seen it before. They didn't know how to react to it. They scored a touchdown. The janitor was in the stadium with his wife watching, and he's jumping up and down, screaming, that's my play, that's my, he's jumping. And his wife's like, no, it's not your play. It is, it really is. Andy Reid went up to him afterwards and congratulated him and thanked him for the play that brought them a touchdown in one of their games. That is communication. That's a willingness to listen and seeing the benefit that comes from it. And that's what Paul is emphasizing in this passage with him and Timothy. Point number 4. Communication propels relationships. We need it, and we can't avoid it. The final piece we see at the end is Paul's elation. When Paul sees, through Timothy's report, that the Thessalonians are growing, that the Thessalonians miss him, that the Thessalonians are excited about Jesus, that the Thessalonians are coming together to worship, that the Thessalonians are encouraging one another, and they're now flourishing, even though they're a tiny congregation, just a handful of people, but they're starting to blossom as believers. When Paul hears about this, he is jumping for joy. And his joy, we find, is not in what he's getting out of it, but what he's watching in their lives, what he is learning about through his servant Timothy. And what we find here is that joy stems from this wonderful news when we have agape, when we have altruism, when we have communication, as we watch others grow. Listen to what we find in John, one of John's letters. 3 John 1:4. I have no greater joy than this, to hear of my children walking in the truth. Now you understand what this looks like on other levels. As a parent or a grandparent, aunt, uncle, friend, when you see, especially with kids, you go to that first recital, and they get up there and they bang on the piano, or they play their violin or their flute, whatever. What happens? We get pretty excited. Not because of anything we're getting out of the deal, but we're watching a child grow. When they graduate, when they play baseball and they hit their first, home run, or they get on base, or, at least they're not picking flowers out in the field. Even if they're paying attention, it's a victory for some of these kids. But during the course of being a parent, there are these milestones. It could be catching a fish, it could be scoring a goal, it could be, going to the recital, it could be a ballet performance. There's 1,001 things, but when we watch our children accomplish different things in life, there is a unique sense of joy that captures the heart. And that's the joy Paul has as he was watching this church grow. And that's precisely the joy that we could find as a worshiping community together. It tells us here in Philippians 4:4, rejoice what? Not in your stuff, not in your bank account, not in your accomplishments, not in all the things that you've accumulated, not in the influence you have. Rejoice in what? Rejoice in the Lord always, and I say it again, rejoice. Rejoice in what God is doing in your life and through your life and in the lives of people around, and that would be a lasting joy that Paul is experiencing through hell and high water, through thick and through thin, through good times and bad. Paul is excited and is elated over the fact that God's people are growing. And because of that, he's like that parent on the sideline watching a kid running down the field with the soccer ball and whacking it right through the goal. He is cheering them on, and he is happy about what God is doing in the lives of the people around him. And that was what we find here. Our final point is simply this: rejoice in the Lord. Rejoice in what he's doing in your life and the lives around us. Why do I say all this? Just give you a final picture and we'll land the plane. There's a guy, if you've ever been down in Central Florida, not on the highways, but kind of in the rural parts of Central Florida, you got these county roads, these county highways. They're flat and they're straight and they go forever. And there's this guy some of you remember the old Volkswagen Bugs, that they were really kind of slow. They had the stick shift, and the engine was in the back and not in the front. And there's a guy going down one of these highways in a country there, down in Florida, one of these long, flat, straight roads. He's driving his Volkswagen Bug. And in front of him is this pickup truck full of hogs. And he's behind this truck of pigs, and he's following them along. And he's just driving along. He's looking, there's the pigs. He's looking at him, and he's looking at the pigs. And the guy's going down the road, and he hits a little bump in the road, and one of them hogs flies out of the truck. So the dude in the Volkswagen, he pulls over immediately, and he's safe enough behind the truck, so he didn't hit the pig. And he pulls over, and there's this pig on the side of the road. So he picks up the pig, and the pig he's kind of dazzled and confused and bruised and a little bumped up, but it seems to be okay. So he thinks to himself, well, I got to get this pig back to this guy in the truck. So he takes the pig, and he puts it on the front seat of his Bug, and he takes off down the road. Now the truck is way down the highway, so he's driving after this truck with the pigs, and he's got this pig on the front seat. Now, you know those cars, they're slow. So he was speeding, but it was tough for him to catch up because they really didn't go very, very fast. Well, he's flying as fast as he could to try to catch this truck way down the road there, and all of a sudden there's a cop that pulls out. And this cruiser gets behind him, and the guy's he's racing with the pig on the front seat, truck ahead, and he's racing down after this truck, and all of a sudden he looks and he sees the lights. He goes, "Oh no, I'm busted." So he pulls over on the side of the road, and the sheriff gets out. He walks over and he looks around. And he says, "Whoa, what's with the pig?" He's like, "What's going on here?" And the guy explains the story. He says, I was driving down the road and I saw the truck with the hogs, and the hog fell out, and I picked him up and cleaned him up, and I'm trying to get this hog back to the truck. And the sheriff looks down the road, and then now they're like way down there. He's like, "You're never going to catch up with them, and I don't want you speeding anymore. Here's what you're going to do. I'm not going to give you a ticket. I appreciate your concern, but here's what we're going to do. I want you to take that pig to the zoo." The guy's like, "Okay, I'll take the pig to the zoo." So keeps the pig on the front seat of the car and takes off, and the sheriff takes off. Next day, the sheriff is in that same highway. He's in the bushes, with a speed trap, and he sees that Volkswagen coming down the highway. And he's like, "Wait a minute." He's not speeding, but he's like, "There's somebody with the guy. It's the same Volkswagen." And he looks, and he's like, "Dang, the pig is with him." And he's like, What's so he's like, so the sheriff, he takes off, and he goes chasing after this Volkswagen, and sure enough, the guy's driving down the road. He's got the pig on the front seat with him, and he pulls him over, and he's like, "Buddy," he's like, the guy was upset. He's like, "Why'd you pull me over, Sheriff? What's going on? I wasn't speeding." "No, you weren't speeding, but you got the pig on the front seat of the car." And he's like, "I thought I told you yesterday to take that pig to the zoo." And the man looks at the sheriff. He says, "Officer, I did take the pig to the zoo, and we had such a good time. I'm taking him to the beach today." Everybody wants a meaningful relationship. Let's pray.